Good evening all, and welcome to a special and important installation of ZFA Conversations. My name is Bren Carlill, and I'm the Public Affairs Director at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching us. Now, for most of you, our guests this evening require no introduction. Professor Gerald Steinberg is Emeritus Professor at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, where he founded the program on conflict management and negotiation. His research focuses on Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and non-governmental organizations, and Israeli politics and arms control. He is best known internationally and in Australia for being the founder and president of NGO Monitor, which critically examines the many allegations made about Israel by human rights organizations and also reveals who their funders are. Doing so as a way to both correct the record and also inject a smidgen of transparency into what are often ideologically driven campaigns against Israel rather than mere concern for universal human rights. Gerald is joined this evening by Herzberg, NGO Monitor's legal advisor. Anne's areas of research include business and human rights, international human rights law, the laws of armed conflict, universal jurisdiction, international fact-finding, NGOs, and the UN. She is the author of the widely cited NGO Lawfare, Exploitation of Courts in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and co-author of numerous works, including the highly relevant False Knowledge is Power, Deconstructing Definitions of Apartheid that delegitimized the Jewish state. An NGO Monitor report that was published in just December last year. And Gerald, welcome. You are
Thank
both
you very much.
There we go. Good to join us.
Can I get the mute?
But thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday morning in Israel. It's as I said, it's a really important topic, and I'm so glad that you were both able to join us tonight. Look, I think you'll both find that during this conversation that I and almost all of our viewers are in furious agreement with you about the nature of the Amnesty International report and the legitimacy of its allegations against Israel. But I think many find the report almost overwhelming in its audacity, its volume of observations about Israel, its range, and ultimately the fact that Amnesty plus Human Rights Watch plus some other human rights groups are finding that Israel practices apartheid. So tonight, I would like us to explore some of the falsehoods in the Amnesty report, but I'd also like to explore some of the ways we can address those falsehoods in conversations with our friends and colleagues who might otherwise be convinced by Amnesty's allegations. So Anne, I'll start with you. When someone accuses Israel of practicing apartheid, what do you say to them?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that apartheid is a legal term. It's often used colloquially. We've heard, ridiculous claims like vaccine apartheid, water apartheid. You even hear it used gender apartheid, these types of terms. But what it's referring to is the situation in South Africa, Southern Africa, really, from the before that, but let's say institutionalized in the late 1940s through the early 1990s. And subsequent to that, there were a few international treaties that have put a prohibition against apartheid into the terms. So it is a prohibition in international law. However, the surprising fact about it is there's no one definition of apartheid. So that's the first thing. The second point is there is a real, one thing that I will say that HRW and Amnesty have both tried to do is decontextualize the legal prohibition of apartheid from conditions in South Africa. And they do it in a very kind of sneaky way because there is a treaty known as the 1973 Convention Against Apartheid. And that treaty was actually not adopted by any Western countries. it was sort of a weapon used by the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc to get at the Western countries. So maybe about 100 countries have signed on to it. So it's not a binding treaty, but it gave a definition of apartheid as a crime against humanity, and it gives several definitions. So it's not binding on Australia, America, Israel, because they never signed on to this treaty.
But does that treaty reference South Africa and sort of make it obvious that it's supposed to be conditions similar to South Africa?
Exactly. So what Amnesty and HRW do when they make this allegation against Israel is they decontextualize the South African experience, which is explicitly in that treaty. So they try to use that treaty for other purposes, because the treaty also includes a list of acts by a state that may constitute the crime. But it also says you have to look at it in context of what was going on in South Africa and similar practices and policies to what was going on in South Africa. So they completely erase that part of the treaty when they rely upon it. Now, there's also the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which includes as a crime against humanity against apartheid. And that is what both reports were trying to claim Israel was, they were violating some prohibition in this Rome statute, because as we all know, a year ago, it was actually 1 year ago, this past Friday, the International Criminal Court in a 2-1 highly controversial decision found that the prosecutor of the court could open an investigation in the situation in Palestine. So that's really what prompted these reports and why they're trying to tag it to the Rome statute, because under their wildest dream would be some sort of international criminal court case against Israel for this crime. And so that's why their reports are tagged to it. But then when you get into the details, they conflate several other treaties that don't have anything to do with the Rome statute, and again, selectively cite to it. So they kind of are trying to pull a fast one, and most people are not experts, so they wouldn't really understand that this is what's going on.
And you have done the same thing that I always do, and I'm very guilty of it. And because I'm so steeped in my work, that when someone asks me a question, I launch into, in your case, it was international treaty law. In my case, it's whatever it is, whatever details, and I dive right down into those weeds. And at least in my case, I'm certainly not casting aspersions upon yourself, but in my case, I find that people's eyes glaze over because there's too much detail. So I'm going to come back to you. What I'm going to ask you later on is how do we, when the average person, as I was saying just before we started, we brought everyone else.
Yeah.
The average person is not going to read 280 pages of Amnesty International.
Exactly.
They're not even going to read the executive summary. All right. They're also not going to read your 200 plus pages of rebuttal, which even though they should. So, how do we, when someone says Amnesty International, which I trust because they're a leading human rights organization, they say Israel's apartheid. Therefore, Israel must be an apartheid state, or there must be something to it. I want to go back to that, but Gerald, you have written, and others as well, but I always associate it with you. You've written about the Durban Strategy that started with the conference in 2001. Can you give us a high-level description of what that strategy actually is?
Let me continue on from what Anne talked about, what you just talked about, because the Durban conference that took place in September, the end of August, early September 2001, laid out what they call the plan of action, a final declaration, particularly in the NGO forum. That was the main action of the Durban conference. This was a huge, for people who don't remember, for me, it was like yesterday, it was 20 years ago plus. The United Nations in those days, the Commission on Human Rights, decided in their infinite wisdom to bring together 5,000 representatives of non-governmental organizations, plus they also had a diplomatic forum. And in that context, they were supposed to celebrate the end of South African apartheid. That whole process, including all the funding and everything else, was hijacked. It was hijacked, led by partly the Palestinian lobby, certainly by the organization of what's now called the Islamic Cooperation, which is the largest single bloc inside the United Nations, and of course all these NGOs. So you had Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and Al-Haq and all the Palestinian groups, and those were all together a few months before, put together these texts in a meeting in Tehran, in which the terms apartheid are repeated many times in that action plan. They kidnapped it, they hijacked it in order to use it to demonize Israel. That's what happened at Durban. And it was financed, it was supported partly by the European Union, partly by the government of Canada, certainly by the Ford Foundation, and certainly by the United Nations. What we've seen in the last 20 years is the continued emphasis on the allegation, the demonization of Israel through the terms like apartheid, racism, war crimes. But the apartheid, because we're talking about that, was particularly blatant. This was a conference took place in South Africa. It was supposed to celebrate the end of the apartheid regime. And because they were able to hijack it and use it as the basis for attacking Israel, that really set the theme for all of what we're seeing now. They've been at it for 20 years. I know that people that I talked to back then and what they were claiming, they said, well, 5 or 6 years, we'll have Israel sanctioned. It'll be just like South Africa. They won't be going to the Olympics. The regime will be replaced. It's now 20 years later. And I see the Amnesty report, or it's not even a report, it's just a cut and paste of what Human Rights Watch did a year ago and what other organizations did earlier, as not just a continuation, but also a sign of desperation. They're going completely obsessive on this issue because they have not made much progress. Now, you're sitting there in Australia. You just had the Sydney Film Festival, so you might see that as a success for BDS. Certainly, that's the way it's been interpreted. Some see it as a success, some see it as a failure. But for the BDS movement, there's been very little success. And so now they want to go beyond that. That BDS was also started in the Durban process. BDS, lawfare, meaning going to the International Criminal Court, and the emphasis on apartheid and war crimes, that was all part of the package.
But what the strategy depends upon is the idea, and I can understand that Al-Haq and the other various Palestinian organizations and some of the Israeli organizations would be highly motivated to pursue this strategy, right? But why would those big organizations like Amnesty and like Human Rights Watch sign on to this strategy? Aren't they, allow me, it's quite an Australia to ask a Dorothy Dixer to ask an obvious question, but aren't they, great human rights organizations that are objective and just try and report on human rights abuses?
Well, that's certainly the way they portray themselves. And in a lot of ways, they're still portrayed that way by all of their allies in media and diplomats and academics and all that. However, let's be realistic for a minute. That's a big business. It's a huge industry. The days when it was a bunch of very nobly intentioned, neutral people who went out and demonstrated for prisoners of conscience when Amnesty was founded.
Sorry about that.
Modern curse.
Sorry, Gerald.
When Amnesty was founded back in the 1960s, it was to demonstrate, to petition, to protest, to send postcards for prisoners of conscience all over the world. They too were hijacked. NGOs are very vulnerable to hijacking, just like Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch was hijacked. And this also goes back to the era around the time of the Durban conference, a little bit before. So these organizations, number one, are very powerful. They have a huge amount of money. They're easily taken over. Agnes, how do you pronounce her last name, Anne? You know that.
Kalmar. Kalmar.
And Philip Luther, who are the point people for this report. First of all, she's relatively new at Amnesty, but she's been in the whole anti-Israel human rights business for a long time. But we don't know. We have no idea. Not only do we not know how she was chosen, but it's really a classic closed black box. If this was the 1950s, we'd say it was a smoke-filled room. It's all very mysteriously handled, and their corporate finance, 334 million pounds a year as of their last report. But who provides that money? Who decides who's going to spend it, how it's going to be spent, how they get chosen? It's all very mysterious because journalists don't generally seriously look at the inner workings. It's like taking apart a sausage, right? You don't really want to look in there. It's pretty disgusting. And that's in fact why NGO Monitor, why we've been successful in doing what we're doing for 20 years. We're the only ones who said, we got to look at this. We got to take this apart and look at it. So these organizations, are vulnerable to being easily taken over. They're taken over largely by what's called in the academic jargon post-colonialists, are sort of leftover Marxists from the 1950s and even 60s, who were also anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-Western. All this talk about that in 1975, the UN passed this resolution by the General Assembly saying Zionism is a form of racism. Well, the Soviet bloc was a major part of it. It was the Soviet bloc and the Arab League that pushed that through. Well, all the NGOs are just a continuation of that.
See, I believe everything you say, and I've seen enough evidence.
That's good.
Yeah, I've seen enough evidence in my time that what you're saying is backed up by the third-party evidence I've seen. But if I try and have not that we're actually in the offices these days and we're having water cooler conversations, but if I were to have a water cooler conversation with colleagues, and I say, look, Amnesty International is chock full of anti-Israel people, and they're biased. Like, they're gonna say, well, you're saying that because you don't like what Amnesty is saying about Israel. How do we sort of...
Look, it's very hard to make this point, but I think I start off by saying, first of all these NGOs are big business. And almost every time I have these conversations, which again, it's harder to do these days, but if I'm talking to a group of students, I've done a lot of Zoom, and I start off by saying, look, Amnesty has a budget. I ask people, what do you think their budget is? And nobody comes even close to saying 334 or 300 or any 100 million euros a year. And Human Rights Watch is close to 100. And when I say it's an industry, it's a corrupt industry. It's an industry that hides so much of what it does. So first of all, if you look at it as an industry which has no oversight, no ethical guidelines, no checks and balances, and it presents this image which nobody questions of being neutral, expert, not biased in any way, stop a minute and look at that. So I don't start on the Israel issue. I start on the entire industry. And as soon as you say corrupt, they say, what do you mean corrupt? And I say, well, where do they get their money? What about the fact that the Amnesty a few years ago had I think it's called the Secretary General, the top person, who was forced to resign, we don't know. There was money that was large amounts of money that were exchanged. There was an investigation into corruption, but it's super secret. You can't get that information. If you're a member of Amnesty, you'll never know there was corruption, and the media almost entirely swept it under the table. Or the allegations by a number of Amnesty employees, I mean, the list is very long. Why don't we hear about that? So if you raise questions about the way in which these organizations and the people that control them set their agendas, then you say, okay, now why do they spend so much time obsessing over Israel? Is it because Israel's an apartheid state? Or maybe because their money comes from secret sources, like Human Rights Watch took $400-something thousand from a corrupt Saudi billionaire and hid it for 7 or 8 years, completely denied they ever got the money. And how much more is being hidden? And what about Amnesty? Where do they get their money from? Why don't they talk about that ever? Why don't they deal with the issues of racism and gender discrimination and alliances with terrorist organizations, all of which are documented, and not only by NGO Monitor. So I think all of those issues need to be put on the table. And then you get to the specifics of why are they putting out this absolutely anybody, you're right, nobody know. I noticed that almost nobody, I listened to a podcast just now by 2 prominent journalists. One of them is Jonathan Friedland from The Guardian. And they were talking about the Amnesty report, except it was clear he hadn't read the report. He was citing another journalist who probably also, Angelo Pfeffer from Haaretz, 280 pages, except for the crazies in NGO Monitor, who bothers to read it. And if you read it, you see both what Anne was talking about, the absurdity in their quasi definitions. It's not really it's not South African apartheid, it's a different kind of apartheid. But you also see that it's just a cut and paste job from other people's other reports that are out there, and it's all scrambled and it's incoherent and it's repetitive and it's garbage. But nobody they read the headlines, they read the journalists may read the 2-page press summary, and they read other people's repetitions of the same thing. So we really have to open up this black box.
Well, see, Anne, when I was reading through the report, what I found, and I think you'll be in a much better position to expand on this than me, but what I found was they would take facts that were true, and they would scrub them of any context whatsoever and bring them out so they become absurd, but you still can't point to them and say, that's wrong, right? But what it does, I mean, even if we, because what I've seen is quite a few Palestine activists in Australia have said, look, the Jewish community up in arms that Amnesty has accused Israel of apartheid, but they're not actually addressing any of the claims in the report, right? So if we pretend that Amnesty didn't use the word apartheid, they would just release this big long report that documents all sorts of discrimination against Israel. I mean, so how do we say, well, do we say, because obviously, we all agree Israel is not free of discrimination and all of that, but are there elements, in your opinion, are there elements to that report that are true if exaggerated, or is it all lies?
So before I answer your specific question, I just want to point out part of the problem is we see this with the HRW, we see this with Amnesty. So they both put out the Amnesty report now is 280 pages. The Human Rights Watch report, I believe, was 302 pages. It's very easy to level a charge. So so Amnesty opens its report with Israeli authorities are doing a concerted plan in Sheikh Jarrah. That was the opening line of the report. Now, to explain, to the audience here or to a journalist or to refute the charge, it will take someone like me 10 pages to write the refutation because the answer is quite complicated. You can't explain it. Yeah. And that's really what's so pernicious about this report. So the way I've looked at it, it's sort of like 300 pages of one-line claims that require at least a paragraph to show why what they're saying is completely distorted and false. Now, one thing that my co-author, Barrister Josh Kern, and I did, and I put the link in the chat. So our report that came out in December, we wanted to first talk about the history of the charge, how you define it in international law. And then in a couple of weeks, we're going to be putting out a second volume, which is going to talk about specific topics like that are raised in Amnesty. Right. So hopefully that will help people be able to refute specific claims. But even in the Amnesty report, things that struck me were when they were talking about army service, they would say right. Jewish Israelis are, have mandatory army service, but Arab Palestinians do not. And actually, I believe the law is that everyone has mandatory army service. Certain people can get exemptions. They don't talk about Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel also are largely exempt from army service. Right. So, it's these kinds of things where they talk about how Israel was repressing Palestinian free speech because there have been attempts to ban political parties. And then when it turns out, the only example where a party has been banned is actually Kach, a Jewish extremist party. Yeah. No Arab parties have been banned. So it's kind of things like that. There's very little in the report that is accurately portrayed.
And really, I think the most hollow part of the report is when they talk about Israel. I mean, the Amnesty have made the big advance. They're not calling the occupation apartheid. They're calling Israel itself apartheid. Notice, as I think you guys pointed out, they scrubbed the reference to 1948 in their final report, but it's repeated in the conclusions and the recommendations. It is on page 200 and something. So it's still there.
They did it a couple other places too, where
they spent 5 minutes at the very last minute because we had preempted their publication, and they were getting attacked. They were getting condemned, even by the U.S. government. So they really had to do something to change it, to try to preserve some credibility.
They just didn't do a very good job. But really, the hollow part of the report is, they talk about, the security provisions against Israeli Arabs in the late 1940s, the early 50s.
Right.
And, without explaining any context. And then after that, they're like, well, and then some, Negev Bedouins have been moved into, moved out of where they want to be and into, more permanent locations. And that's their sort of, that's dispossession of Arab Israelis. It was particularly weak. And then, of course, they've ignored the, as as everyone has pointed out, the Arab High Court judges, the Arab Minister of Government who tweeted that actually
right, that it's
not actually apartheid.
I mean, even just their press conference negated the whole report. What did they do? They had a press conference in Israel claiming Israel's this, rights violating illegal regime with an Arab MK at their press conference, failing to see the irony of that.
Wow,
and also, like, how is your freedom of speech being, blocked? You're allowed to have this press conference in Israel saying the most heinous, outrageous charges.
But they were allowed to do it. Gerald, I want to ask you two questions. The first is, Robin Rothfield has written a question in the Q&A box saying, have you read the report by B'Tselem, which I'm sure you have. B'Tselem are not Palestinian activists. They are not foreign, Marxist activists. They are Israelis. I want you to, if you can, comment on that report and their motivations. But also another question is, have Amnesty published reports about other difficult or complex situations in other parts of the world that are hopelessly one-sided or hopeless or ideologically motivated and obscure the truth?
I'll do the second question first because it's quick, and that is, we haven't looked at all the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch put out a lot of material. It seems that for the most part, there's an obsession with Israel for all the reasons we talked about earlier, and this type of bias. The Chinese will say that the Amnesty reports on Hong Kong, I don't know if they've done anything on Tibet for the last 20 years, but on Hong Kong are biased. But there, you can look at the reports, you don't have the absurdities. I mean, I think ridicule is an important part of this whole process. They use the term apartheid 400 times. That means that it's more than once on each page, because it's not about the substance, it's about the messaging. It's an agitprop propaganda process. They use the term Jewish domination 100 and something times in this report.
Yeah.
So you see it's memes and themes. It's not about substance, and they know that most people aren't going to read the report. So there's something very specific, political, ideological, emotional. And yes, I don't know in many cases. We know some of the people at Amnesty, their names are not on this report, but there have been Amnesty people who've been reprimanded for anti-Semitism, for tweeting anti-Semitism, but then they stay on the job. And there's a whole history there behind it of this. So there's also that aspect to it. On B'Tselem, look, B'Tselem has gone through a number of different iterations. It's again one of those things where if you don't follow the details, and you look at B'Tselem as what it was in the 1990s or in early 2000, that it's an organization that uses Human Rights Watch to protest against Israeli policies, but the reports are reliable, even if you don't agree with the conclusions. That's no longer the case. The last few years, B'Tselem has been run by an individual who is also very obsessive in an Israeli context in imposing his particular ideology and position through B'Tselem's activities and through their influence outside of Israel. They have almost no influence in Israel. There was a time when the IDF would even consult with B'Tselem about specific incidents and allegations of violations of human rights by soldiers. That doesn't happen anymore because they're off the wall. They're absolutely off the wall. And they say very explicitly, our goal is to create enough international pressure on Israel to force Israel to go back to originally it was to the pre-1967 lines, but now the B'Tselem line is the same as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, the entire industry, which is Israel is an apartheid state. We are evil. Now, B'Tselem doesn't represent anybody except a handful of people still involved with the organization. But it gets visibility because it has that same neutral or that same reputation, and that your question exactly reflects that. That's how the NGO industry works. Anybody who thinks that this was accidental, that B'Tselem published a report about a year and a half ago, I think, beginning of 2021, so maybe a year ago, that uses the word apartheid and Jewish, I think they used the term Jewish superiority.
River to the sea. Yeah. Jewish supremacy and river to the sea rhetoric.
And then a couple of months later, Human Rights Watch does it in a massive, the same language, but in a massive way. And then 8 months later, Amnesty comes along because we got to get on the bandwagon. We also think Israel's an apartheid state. Let's just take their reports and redo them. So B'Tselem is being used as a shield to say, oh, we're not anti-Semitic because here's an Israeli group and here's another group and here's a couple of other groups, but the substance is the same. And the lack of any kind of serious engagement with the issues. There's a huge difference between, and it's interesting though how this is playing out, between disagreeing, criticizing Israeli policies, even condemning Israeli policies, and calling in Israel an apartheid state. When you say Israel's an apartheid state, there's no justification for its existence. So it's interesting to see the dance that organizations like J Street are doing. We don't agree with Amnesty, put out a statement after a few days. I'm sure they had many internal deliberations of exactly how to nuance this because they're kind of in and they're kind of out. I have not seen the New Israel Fund take a position. If somebody has it, I'd be interested in seeing it. If they have not taken a position, I think it really reflects, because they take a position on everything, it really reflects it on the one hand, hey, it's their money and their support behind B'Tselem that is pushing the apartheid theme. That Israel is inherently evil. That's what we have to understand from this. It means Israel, the Jews do not have the right to have a state, to have sovereign equality, to have self-determination, because a Jewish state is uniquely evil in apartheid.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the conversation point that I've been having with various people I've been speaking to, that, you know, Amnesty don't appear to be worried about the fact that the draft Palestinian constitution defines Palestine as an Arab state and all the other Arab states, but the Jewish state, it's the one state.
Because it's the obsession, right? It is the obsession. So what I was going to say was that these organizations, certainly in the case of J Street, where they say, we don't agree with Amnesty, but we think Israel should stop being an occupier. That's a very different position. Now, they're not brave enough to say Amnesty is immoral in calling Israel an apartheid state. You're hurting the cause of the Israeli left and the Jewish left in trying to push Israel towards moving away from the current policies that have been in place since 1967. But that's exactly what's happening. When you say Israel's an apartheid state, Israel, from 1948, as we just talked about, that the Israeli law of return from 1950, allowing Jews to have citizenship, is inherently a form of apartheid, uniquely singling out Israel, which, by the way, is one of the examples of anti-Semitism in the IHRA working definition, and that's clearly reflected in all these reports.
Yeah.
So if you can't condemn that, that's also a problem.
Yeah. Look, you mentioned Gerald and Anne, whoever feels more qualified to answer this, please jump in. You mentioned anti-Semitism there in the IHRA definition. In Australia, we were absolutely thrilled that late last year, the Prime Minister announced that Australia would embrace the working definition, which is wonderful, and this certainly is. And we, many of you, and I believe NGO Monitor has said that the Amnesty report is anti-Semitism. But I mean, would you say that the people, would you say that the people who wrote this report are motivated by a personal hatred of Jews? Like, I mean, how would you define or cast that anti-Semitic nature of the report?
Well, we don't really know who wrote it. I mean, I think that's a primary problem. Amnesty refuses to say who wrote the report. So
maybe because nobody actually wrote it, they cut and paste from other reports.
Right. But like to say, they were working, like, I will say Human Rights Watch is slightly more sophisticated than Amnesty in its execution. So HRW will typically list who are all the people that worked on it, who were their researchers. At least you have a better idea. But in this case, we have no idea. We don't know if maybe they were relying on Palestinian NGOs to write the report, for all we know. We just have no idea, or maybe they were law students.
And there's no, are other Amnesty reports, do they have authors? I mean, do they have named authors?
Sometimes. It just depends.
So is there any sort of governmental or philanthropic pressure that we can say, listen, Amnesty, you've really got to... Or is it just like these big organizations, the people in charge take responsibility? You said,
Well, I mean, I think what, Gerald made the point that, like, this is an industry that isn't regulated, even though they get, much more money than a lot of corporations, which are highly regulated, so I think that's the primary problem. But also I think the problem is journalists have not been asking them who wrote the report. No one's putting their feet to the fire either.
Yeah.
Asking, not, I wouldn't say no one, but very few. There was
I'm
a good
gonna add to that,
yeah,
there was a very good interview with the
right, in the
two
Times of Israel,
ringleaders
but
that came to Israel. And look, the stories are interesting. The two people who came to Israel, actually there were three. At least three people from Amnesty came, and they did the press conferences and they did the social media stuff. And Lazer Berman, who is a reporter at the Times of Israel, who lives in the old city of Jerusalem, wrote, and he's not by any means a hard right winger at all. He wouldn't be working for the Times of Israel if he was. And he interviewed them, and you can watch them falling in step after step after step. Each time he asked them a question, they could not answer. Why did you do this report on Israel? How did you, why are you using the term up? All of those terms. I'm going to put the link to that because I think it's very much worth reading. It shows that they are incapable. The nuances that Ann talked about and the slightly higher level of professionalism, at least with Human Rights Watch, you know what you're getting.
I've actually got someone, I think that's you, Viviana. Are you there? No, I think that might be a mistake. I've got a feeling so. I don't think she actually meant to participate. So I'm just going to mute you, Viviana.
With Human Rights Watch, you know, the history of Ken Roth is very clear. I wrote a long academic piece, a number of them showing how deeply personally for his, and he's was born Jewish, but there's a lot of personal psychology there that I can speculate on. And Omar Shakir, whose name is also on the report, who's considered the principal author of that the original the Human Rights Watch apartheid report. Omar Shakir, that's his career, is hating Israel and being anti-Zionist and all of the elements of the Ayad report. With Amnesty, because of what Ann said, you don't know the names of the people, but you can certainly see, not just in this example, in the case of the interview and their press conference, but we've had interactions with them in the past. Philip Luther he's got a personal vendetta. And I think it's also true with Agnes. And although I don't know, it's interesting. The head of Amnesty USA, who is the third person here, has no experience at all. He said, we've been working on this report for 3 years. They said it was 4 years. They can't even get the story straight.
Well, my favorite is that they said that they rocked up to Israel in January this year and spent 3 days there. And that was, and
then they know everything. But he wasn't working for Amnesty. He started working for Amnesty just about 9 months ago.
Wow.
And so he has no idea what the history is, or if he does, and he has no history, no knowledge, no expertise at all on the conflict. So he just reads his lines like an actor. And he's got to people have to call them out for what it is. And then that is for whatever reason it is fundamentally a form of Israel eliminationism, anti-Zionism, and that is a form of anti-Semitism.
Well, look, I think, speaking of calling them out, this is an interesting question from Alan Slade, because of course it doesn't refer to the IRA definition, but there are echoes of it. As you know, the IRA definition says comparing Israel to the Nazis is anti-Semitic. Bang on. Alan Slade is asking, in which way is the abuse of the word apartheid different from the misuse of the word Nazi? Maybe I can rephrase his question and ask, if you call Israel a Nazi state, I reckon you're an anti-Semite in effect, if not in intent. If you call Israel an apartheid state, is that an automatic, tick against your name, or what's?
Well, I mean, according to the definition, if you are tagging it to the fact that Israel is Jewish self-determination, so the fact that, what is Amnesty harping on, like Gerald said, the law of return, or policies that allow Israel to preserve and celebrate, promote its Jewish character, those are policies considered by Amnesty to be apartheid. And I think in that case, they are anti-Semitic. Now, of course, if you had a country, and even one that was, a Jewish country that was engaging in the types of practices which we saw in South Africa, which it is not, but let's say they were, I don't think that would be anti-Semitic to call that country out. But what we've been seeing, and really it's important to look at the history, because this charge really originated in the late 50s and 60s. And what it was doing was it was trying, at the time, is particularly at the UN, there were a few key core evils that were called out in every kind of human rights statement made by the United Nations at the time: Nazism, colonialism, apartheid, racism. And so that's really where it began, because they wanted to make Israel appear to be, a state that was against the international legal order, against peace and security. And that's why it's important, because it wasn't based on any policies. It was merely the existence of Israel. And I think that's where, you have to draw the distinction.
Yeah, I hear that. We're going to change topic yet again, but this goes and to my initial question about, what would you say to someone if they accused Israel of being an apartheid state, without diving into those weeds. David Noel asked the question: what are your 3 most impactful but brief comments that even a not terribly bright journalist would be floored by?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that they're, talking about 1948, I mean, that to me, is kind of the story right there.
Well, I mean, look, if that journalist has been to Israel, then you can just say, well, look.
Right.
I will add 2 other points which I think are critical here. Number one is, why use the term apartheid on Israel? Then they say, well, we do use it someplace else in Myanmar, sort of, but we never did a campaign like this. It's not on the human rights.
Well, and the definition's different. That the one they use in Myanmar is much closer to the actual definition than what they're doing here. So that's the other difference. Yeah,
and the fact that it's the singling out of Israel. It's only about Israel. They haven't looked at, and that's what the article that you just posted on the chat list. That's what the reporter started and comes back to. He says, "What about China?" Yeah. And they can't answer that question. So I think it's important to confront them with just a couple of key issues that demonstrate the extreme hostility. And if you don't want to call it anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism, it's anti-Israelism. Why? And they can't answer that. And
I would also add, I would add also just the fact how they would talk about Hamas. I mean, when they're talking about, when they give examples of Palestinians they claim who've been persecuted, they're all Hamas members who were in jail for committing violence. Or the way they write about the war last summer, they mentioned some throwaway line about the rocket attacks, not noting it was over 4,000 attacks in 10 days. They ignore that. And most egregiously, the way they described the suicide bombing campaign of the early 2000s, they described it as bombs were placed in crowded areas. Yeah. So they completely gloss over the context that necessitates a lot of Israel's policies. And they talk about popular resistance over and over again. So they're really crossing a line. I mean, to me, that's also totally egregious, just to the way they're attacking Israel's legitimacy, but just the way they seem to be glossing over Hamas. And it's not the first time they've done this. I mean, in 2010, they fired the head of their gender rights unit, Gita Sagal, because she was speaking out against Amnesty's partnerships with a Taliban supporter. And what did the head at that time, Cordon, I forget his first name, something Cordon, said in response was that jihad and self-defense is not a violation of human rights. And so, they've had this partnership with this group called CAGE, which was linked to a lot of ISIS. There were some allegations a few years ago how they had a link to some Al-Qaeda NGO.
Well, CAGE had a webinar. CAGE had a webinar last year where CAGE had the Hamas spokesperson and a Palestine activist from Australia who pretends to be a peace activist, all on the same webinar. It was
wow. Yeah. So I think that also is that's kind of it's sort of highlighting their ideology, not just in the Israel case, but overall. So I think that's also quite outrageous.
Yeah. Look, someone has said, and I think this is an example, a great chance for you to spruik some of your publications that said, will you guys release a statement condemning the corruption of Amnesty International vis-a-vis its massive budget and all the rest of it? Is there anything out there on your website or something that people might look at to sort of to see some of Amnesty's corruption or sins, so to speak?
We have a, yeah, oh, go ahead, Gerald, sorry.
I'll post that also in a minute on the chat list, but we have in the NGO Monitor website, which is www.ngo-monitor.org, easy to find. And again, I'll post the specific link. If you look up on the A to Z list, you'll see Amnesty. And one of the first sections in that relatively long entry on Amnesty is corruption. And it has specific examples and links, and we need to expand that. We now recognize that we're going to have to go into more detail, but the corruption elements, all these things that we've been talking about, from the affair of the retiree funding scandal to the Gita Sagal and the cage prison, all of those things are all part of that. We have those all listed there. We are a one-stop shopping place for the information that's available.
Because that's the thing, and obviously this is this is also the role of the Jewish community organizations in each country, or the Zionist organizations in each country, to sort of to collate these facts and bring them together. And well, of course, we do what we can, but having a one-stop shop on these big organizations it's good. So yeah. So
I don't remember how there was a time when we were originally doing World Vision, which by the way is a whole other scandal, which we are in the process of unraveling further.
Because of its Australian origins, that
right, exactly. But the fact that, again, the government money that was used and abused and not accounted for, but also at the time, I remember that there was something called Australian Aid Abroad. No, it wasn't that. Amnesty had a different name in Australia. Do they now function under their own names? I don't remember, but I believe, in any case, Amnesty does have an operation in Australia. And they should certainly, the people there should be confronted with this information. And I think a good place to start is on the issue of, do you know how your money is being spent? And if you do know, then how is it being spent? And if you're not involved, if you just send it to London and it just disappears, then you should have some responsibility. If it's your money, you should be interested in that. And then among other things, that can lead to the question of, okay, why did they end up doing so much emphasis and obsession with Israel, and this really completely absurd. I think ridicule is also an important part of this. The report, the text of the report, you can start with the 400 times using the word apartheid and then saying, well, it's not really South African apartheid, and then go into some of the other aspects depending on whether the people there are still willing to engage with you. But I think that they are vulnerable. That's the point I want to make. That to make a few points to people who say, oh, they're a wonderful organization, then you ask them in most cases, well, what do you know about what the organization does? And the best they can do is quote back to you the PR job that the organization does in order to raise money. Well, that's not serious. You have to have, especially now we're in the age of woke, progressive, liberal responsibility, you have to have responsibility for the causes that you support. And if you don't take that responsibility, if there is no accountability, then there's something that needs to be done about that. And you put the onus back on them. And I think the Amnesty people now are quite nervous about that.
Good. Well, I bloody hope so. I'm Gerald. The last question I wanted to say is obviously this Amnesty report, in a way, as we were discussing, it's sort of in the news, it disappeared from the news cycle, at least in Australia, very quickly. And I suggested it could be because the sensible people out there realize that Amnesty has jumped the shark by calling Israel itself an apartheid state rather than anyone else. Rather than just focus on the occupation, which of course would be it would of course be wrong, but it would be on par with what other people have said. But what I want to ask you is, what do you think, Anne, as well? Where is this going? Will this Amnesty report hurt Israel in the future?
I mean, it's not, I'll say two things. Number one, the main goal of this report at this time is because there are two UN bodies that are looking at this question under the auspices of the Human Rights Council. And so Amnesty wanted to get its report in before they put their reports out. So, that's why this report is timed now. So I highly expect by June, we will have two UN reports calling Israel apartheid, going back to like the Zionism is racism moment. So we can all expect that that's going to happen. And the reason they do it that way is because Amnesty maybe doesn't have a lot of purchase anymore, but once you put a UN stamp on something, it's much harder to counter because of the UN's influence. So that's why they're timing it this way. But then I would say the other kind of negative or troubling thing that bothers or worries me is that this report is going to be used to harass Jews outside of Israel. I don't think it's going to have a lot of impact within Israel per se, but I do think it's going to harm Jews in the diaspora, increasing harassment on college campuses, kind of boycotting or deplatforming campaigns in the diaspora. And so I think, for those reasons, that's why it's so important to counter, these efforts, even though, we can all say, oh, Amnesty, no credibility, who cares? But unfortunately, we do see that it can have detrimental effects.
Yeah, I think that, as Anne said, this is all part of a process. It goes back to what we talked about earlier. You're looking at it over 20 years. I'm careful about the crystal ball part. I don't know whether a year or 2 years from now anybody will remember this. It's interesting. Here's an example. First of all, the Durban plan of action is still very much alive, although we're moving very slowly for them. And this is just another attempt to recreate it, just as it's an attempt to revive the 1975 resolution on Zionism being racism. Look, the bottom line is the Palestinians and their supporters, including a lot of anti-Semites, back in 1947, when the UN partition plan was adopted, and 1948, when Israel was created, Israel happened to win the war. Terrible thing. Palestinians were displaced, all of that. Their goal is still the elimination of Israel. And I think we need to put that back on the table. That's the issue. I'm not going to argue. I'll let Anne do that, but I'm not going to argue about whether Israel is an apartheid state or not. I am going to argue that if you single out Israel and you use this kind of a language, your goal is to eliminate Israel. Why? What is it that motivates you to do that? You put the ball back in there, plus the fact that there's so much money behind this, and I think we need to definitely re-emphasize that, and including, this is something that we sit in Jerusalem, we have a total of 20 people in our office. We can't do, but if each country were to take the Amnesty and the Human Rights Watch, just to start with those two, Australia doesn't give much money, the government does not give much money to other NGOs. In the past, they kind of did, and we had good meetings with them, and they stopped, the government stopped, and this was over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, Michael Danby is no longer in Parliament, but there are other people there who are very much aware of these issues and work for them. But what I'm saying is, I would encourage people in Australia to take a close look at the Amnesty International structure there, where they raise money, how they raise money, and say, look, there are many good other opportunities to promote human rights. This is not one of them. And these are the reasons why. And I think that could have an effect. They really don't like it when the spotlight is turned against them. They don't know how to handle it. And in fact, in many cases, they make their case worse because they overreact. So I think it's important to put the onus on them. We're doing the same thing in the UK, where Amnesty is based. We're going to be doing the same thing again. We've done it before in the Amnesty USA, which is has some very mysterious financial issues which we're going to be looking at closely. And the advantage is, and I don't know how it works in Australia, that charities do have very clear obligations in terms of government regulations.
Yeah, they do.
And if you look at them, very often you'll find that they're violating those obligations. In the case of groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch.
That is a good hint, and thank you. That's well, I'm sure there'll be some members of the watching audience that would go straight to, I think it's called the Australian, oh, crikey, someone knows it, the ANC something, that register Australian charities and the Australian Charity and Not-for-Profit Commission. There we go. That register all the not-for-profits in Australia, and including their annual reports and how much money they're going in and going out. So it might be worthwhile having a look at that. Look, thank you to the two of you. We're just a touch off 9 o'clock, so I'll close it off here. Your inputs and your insight and your knowledge has been really welcome. It's, as I said at the outset, it can be so daunting, these attacks against Israel. Israel's an apartheid state, and it's often hard to know how to argue, what to say. And I think some of the arguments that you've told us tonight are really helpful, that we can, depending on the context of the conversations that we're having with our families and with our friends and with our colleagues, that we can talk about it. We're looking forward to, I'm sure everyone's going to be looking at your website. You're going to have a little rush of visits on your website, and we're looking forward for you to putting up and updating your fact sheets there. And Gerald, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thanks a lot.
And all of you for taking the time to be part of this.
No worries at all. Thank you to the watching audience. Everyone have a good week, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.